Okay. Whoops. That's not the right slide. Give me a minute. Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about that memo. Everybody was asking me about it, and so I think we'll talk about it. But there's a number of memos that we should talk about. And my iPad is frustrating me. So we'll talk about the memo. We talk each week about this convergence of events. And I think this week we saw some interesting things in the sense that in the broader scope of things, we live in a society, well, we'll talk about it in a minute. I don't need to do too much in the intro. So there's coming this time where, depending on somebody's view of the rapture, we may be talking about, we're actually living in this 70th week of Daniel. And it won't be a nice time. It's not like the world's in a great shape right now. We're looking at events that are going to happen within that 70th week. And some will happen before. And so that's why we talk about the convergence of events and why we think we live in the end times. This is an interesting map this week. This is a map that is based on people's belief in God. Now, it doesn't mean that they hold to traditional Christian belief or anything like that, but this is just people who believe in God, that they're religious. And so the blue and light colored areas are less belief. Dark blue is not very many people, like 3 to 20%. The brown and green areas are, of course, much higher. So green, this section here, green all the way up, is above 50% believe in God. So you can kind of see that that map kind of tracks the way things went in the last election. I also want to make a disclaimer, because I see these things posted on our YouTube channel every now and then. The fact that I might agree with President Trump on some issues and the way he's doing things does not mean that I worship him. You need to stop making silly arguments to run down other people. Now, look, there are some people out there that really do appear to worship Trump, and I'm concerned about that. That anybody would ever think that way about any human being, especially somebody who claims to be a Christian. But really, people, stop making silly arguments, okay? Just because somebody might agree with Trump on a few issues does not mean that they're worshiping him. And then other arguments that, I've seen some horrible things written about Mike Pence that are not consistent with people that I know that know him pretty well. And of course, the response to me, your friends must be pretty evil people too. So I just think we need to be very careful about the arguments that we make and not make silly ones, because it doesn't help the cause. It doesn't make us look any better. So that's just sort of a disclaimer at the beginning. So here's this. So Cecile Richards, the daughter of the former governor of Texas, Ann Richards. Remember Ann Richards? Poor George. Remember, he just can't help himself. Well, she's headed up Planned Parenthood for many years. She has resigned, or she's going to be leaving. And of course, she's getting all sorts of praise. On the way out, though, one of the things that she's doing is she is challenging the right of physicians to not perform abortions based on moral objections. She thinks that's reprehensible. And the reason for that is a couple weeks ago, the Health and Human Services under Dr. Ben Carson's the Secretary of Health and Human Services, right? You don't even hear about him anymore. Would you think the Congressional Black Caucus would? No, never mind. He announced new regulations that physicians could object to performing abortions on the basis on religious grounds. And this has people like Cecile Richards all upset. Former Planned Parenthood CEO Cecile Richards has attacked the Trump administration's push for freedom of conscience among healthcare workers, saying it is shameful for doctors to opt out of performing abortions because of religious, moral, or personal objections. And why is that? Because she has no moral or religious objections to anything, apparently, except physicians who don't want to kill other babies. And so the legacy of hers is Planned Parenthood did about 3.5 million abortions during her tenure, 12-year tenure, as head of Planned Parenthood. David Brooks, writing in the New York Times, and it's interesting, I've seen some articles and editorials in the New York Times lately, and I'm thinking like, what's wrong? What's going on? And one of these is, David Brooks has an editorial, it was in Friday's newspaper, called The Abortion Memo. 2 Democratic Party leaders from imaginary Democratic consultant rate late-term abortions. And I don't have the image, but recently they were able to fight off banning late-term abortions. And what were people like Chuck Schumer and other people in the Democratic Party doing on the floor of the U.S. Senate? They were high-fiving each other. Do you know how despicable and evil that is, that you would, whether you vote for it or not, that you would celebrate it as a great victory? These people are sick. They are morally bankrupt. And they have no basis to judge anybody else. Listen to what Brooks says in his thing. Let me start with some history. Before Roe versus Wade, the abortion debate looked nothing like it does today. Many leading anti-abortion groups were on the left. The first pro-life rally at the National Mall was organized by the National Youth Pro-Life Coalition, which a co-founder described as an extremely liberal group. The National Catholic Welfare Conference endorsed a platform that included a right to a living wage, a right to collective bargaining, and a right to life from the moment of conception. In 1971, Ted Kennedy, whose relative gave that ridiculous response to the president's State of the Union speech the other night, could declare, wanted or unwanted, I believe that human life, even at its earliest stages, has certain rights which must be recognized: the right to be born, the right to love, the right to grow old. In 1973, Roe versus Wade changed all that, and he goes on to talk about that. And it's a very, you ought to go look up the articles that have been written about that. I want to make sure I don't have anything else. So I want to clear up, conclude some things about the Davos thing that I talked about last week. Dr. Harari's talk about will the future be human? I got a lot of comments about that. There were some things that he said I thought were important, that I thought should be addressed, or we should listen to what he has to say, because frankly they're frightening. Now I asked people what this is, the symbols on the left, and essentially the thing on the left is like a Chinese supercomputer, most powerful computer on the planet. It does like quadrillions of equations in a second. And the Chinese symbols on it, I got about 7 different responses. They're all a little bit different. Essentially, it means like a higher authority, or like God. Now, and so he did part of his speech. This is a picture from Davos, capturing that, and you can see him standing there talking. So in the Q&A, if you remember, he talked about, will the future be human? We're giving up data. We're giving it up freely. We're not even selling our data. We're just giving it willingly to these corporations. And he concluded that the way they're going to get into this is healthcare. So there was a second follow-up, or a subsequent follow-up Q&A session with him. And here's part of the question that goes on at that Q&A.
About China, again, I'm trying to find this middle way. My basic message is not that the Chinese are worse than everybody else or that they are better than everybody else. My basic understanding is that they are ahead of all the other governments in understanding what is happening and what is at stake. And again, this can be something very good because they are thinking about these issues and they come up with solutions before people in other countries realize that the dangers. Or it could be bad, that they are learning how to manipulate it and how to use it. So it can go either way. At present, and again, I'm not an expert on the subject. I haven't studied it deeply enough. The only thing I can say is that they are probably ahead of other governments in understanding the importance.
So I mentioned that last week that, you know, as China's trying to put together this One Belt, One Road initiative to unite Eurasia, Europe, and Asia, as they're putting in railways and all these things, they're also trying to get out ahead on intelligence, artificial intelligence, and computing technology. And they've announced they're going to give a score to their people based on how socially acceptable they are. Like, do they visit the right websites? Do they share the right kind of information with their friends? And you're going to get a score, a grade, and the better you are, I guess the better you'll be treated. And in the hand of a totalitarian, authoritarian regime like China, and the fact that they're out ahead on this, and I think Harari is probably right, that's scary stuff. But all of this raises this whole beast system, one world government, new world order, technology, and how that plays into a mark that's coming where people will buy and sell according to that mark. We don't know exactly what that mark is, but I think it's safe to say that it involves some sort of technology. As people have analyzed this over time, it's always involved some sort of technology. When it was a barcode, or when it was a barcode tattoo, or a chip, or something like that. And it may go beyond that. It may go into some altering of your DNA. In fact, I don't think I included it in my slides. Just let me check. Well, I probably didn't. So if you go to the World Economic Forum YouTube channel, their lead video talks about the fourth industrial revolution. And they talk about how technology is going to be great. It's going to help people walk that couldn't walk before. It's going to correct all these problems. It's going to allow us to live as one and to be unified as a people. And I mean, this is real Tower of Babel type stuff. I mean, now it's possible. I mean, I see the apps, and I see them advertised on television occasionally. You know, somebody who speaks French and somebody who speaks English could sit down on a date and have a conversation with each other because they can have an instantaneous translation, even though the other doesn't speak the same language. And I mean, when I say not speaking the same language, I mean one speaking English and one speaking French. We know that one's male and one's female, and they don't speak the same language anyway, even if they're both speaking English. That's a little joke, okay? But I've been married for 43 years almost, and I know of which I speak. My wife is always telling me things like last Sunday, I saw her back there, slow down. You remember the scene in Taxi? Reverend Jim, they were at the license branch, and he's taking a thing, and he needs help, of course, you know, because his brain has been fried by drugs. And he asks the other guys, hey, what does it mean when you see a yellow light? And they go, slow down. And he goes, what does it slow down? All right, what does? And so that's people that are not communicating very well, even though they're using the same language. So we had this thing where he used this image of Jesus. What will the future look like? And here's another part of, I think this is one of the more frightening things of what he said in his talk.
The fourth question was about God in the intelligent design and gods and clouds. So I was just referring to it, that the word intelligent design immediately brings to mind of many people the creationist idea that all life forms are designed by God. And sometimes people tell me, don't use the word intelligent design. But it is intelligent design, what we are about to see in the world. It's just not the intelligent design of the God of the Bible. It's the intelligent designs of human beings and increasingly of algorithms. This is why I referred to the intelligent design of clouds, of the cloud computing. That designing a life form is such a complicated thing to do that in all likelihood, no human being will be able to do it. But our algorithms may be able to do it for us. And increasingly, we'll see in more and more fields this shift in authority from humans to algorithms. So even if we keep as figureheads, the presidents and the CEOs will continue to be human beings because we don't like the idea of being ruled by algorithms. Actually, these presidents and CEOs, they will be choosing between options dictated by algorithms, often without really understanding how they came to these options and what do these options mean. So you'll still have some human being being given the option, okay, we'll do A, B, or C, but the ones really driving the show will be the algorithms that shape the options in the first place.
Well, that's, the theological implications of that are people won't be ruled by algorithms, they'll be ruled by Satan. They're already being ruled by Satan. I mean, should be obvious. Here's another comment that he made.
What I wasn't sure about is what your view of the future is, whether you think it's a good thing, whether you're, as a scientist, you're quite entranced by its possibilities, or whether you're as scared as maybe some of the other people that have left the room.
I just don't know. I mean, I don't think that anybody has any idea how the world would look like in 40 or 50 years, let alone a century. The only thing we are certain is that it's going to be completely different from what it is today. I don't remember who said it, but somebody said that if they tell you about the world in 2050 and it sounds like science fiction, it's probably not true. But if they tell you about the world of 2050 and it doesn't sound like science fiction, it's definitely not true. So this is the best I can do. I mean, it was always very difficult to be in charge of your destiny. What is unique now is that the big danger for people is no longer exploitation, it's irrelevance. I mean, previously in history, if you were on the wrong side of history, if you didn't understand what was happening and you lost the competition, then you ended up as some kind of serf or manual laborer being exploited by the people who understand and have the power. Now, if you're left behind, you're facing something far worse, which is to be completely irrelevant. They won't even need you as a serf or as a slave.
Yeah, which is a worrying thing, and of course, we're very concerned about how to find meaningful work and meaningful existence for folk in the future, including ourselves. One of the comments by the moderator at the last session in the Congress Center was that Chancellor Merkel, as she passed you in the green room waiting to go on, mentioned that she'd read your book. How involved have you been working with governments or other organizations in trying to kind of think out this next stage of history and try to kind of make sense of it? You also mentioned, a scant respect for the ability of governments to put in place the long-term thinking as well. Are there any good examples of collaborations or signs of hope that we're kind of attacking this in the right way?
I'm not very involved with governments. I mean, I see my job as a historian, and I still regard myself as a historian basically, as just trying to level the playing ground a bit, in the sense of making more people
Well, this is an interesting, I got to change this back. Okay, this was a little clip. I'll just play a short bit of this. This was played in one of the sessions at Davos. And you see what it says, post-truth. Objective facts are less influential than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Now, what have we been talking about here for years? About problems theologically in people that claim to be the church. It's all based on experience. And your experience is what validates what you believe, not whether it's objectively true or not. And this is killing the church. There are large sections of the church that have been completely overtaken by this experiential nature of things. I first talked about it at a conference in 2001 in California, postmodernism, and that we were entering this emotionally driven, experience-driven, post-truth society. And I had a few pastors pass back. It was a church conference. Pastors pushed back on me, saying, "Oh, you don't understand. This will be great for the church." And I think 17 years down the road, I'm more convinced that I was right in 2001 than I was then. It's not been good. But here's a little clip of this from Davos.
Underestimated outcomes have divided the world. Are we in a new era where truth and facts are hollowed out by hysteria? In a world of 24-hour news and a wealth of information, separating fact from fiction is becoming increasingly difficult. How have we ended up in a place where falsities and half-truths have become the reality?
It's a reflection of something deeper, which is the basic lack of authority or the decline of authority of institutions across the board. The things that defined our society, they were corporations, labor unions, a family, churches, political parties. Every single one of those institutions has seen a decline in the number of people saying they trust those institutions.
Not only social media giants are using big data. Political campaigners know exactly who to micro-target with what type of message. Does technology have implications for our democracy?
I think actually technology plays a role because a lot of these institutions have actually become much, much more transparent. And when people actually see the way that they function in reality, they don't like it, even though there's actually been no change.
Our beliefs, whether based in fact or not, are reinforced through complex algorithms and spread throughout the social networks. When people are getting their news from social media, shouldn't their literacy include the skills to also evaluate information for authenticity and validity? Whether fake news makers are politically or financially driven, are fake news laws an appropriate countermeasure?
J'ai décidé que nous allions faire évoluer notre dispositif juridique pour protéger la vie démocratique de ces fausses nouvelles.
In a democratic society, freedom of expression is fundamental. But we also need facts, transparency, and the truth.
Well, that was an interesting thing, and so we do live in this post-truth thing. Now, it was interesting this week, though. There were some events this week, and it seems like I mentioned on my Facebook page, like Thursday, it was like Trump's State of the Union speech was like, what, 3 weeks ago, right? Because all the stuff that transpires on a day. But wasn't it great that they got together in the chamber of the House, beneath that "In God We Trust" thing that's right there above the podium, and we saw our country united and excited to be working together on things. I'm not going to play much of the speech. I will show just one clip that sort of encapsulated the evening as President Trump said this.
And freedom stands tall over one more monument. This one, this Capitol, this living monument. This is the monument to the American people.
And that was Congressman Gutierrez from California who was walking out. The facial contortions of Nancy Pelosi, I think it would have been entertaining to just have a split screen on her throughout the entire speech. We had this conflict over immigration. Daniel Greenfield, if you go to Front Page magazine, he has a number of columns that he's been writing, very prolific this week. And he has a number, I'll mention a couple, and I think his analysis of a lot of things has been as spot on as anything that I've seen all week. He also writes at the Sultan Kanish. His blog is called Sultan Kanish. He's an Orthodox Jew. I think he lives in Los Angeles. Very bright, very spot on with his analysis. And one of his columns this week, he talked about DACA and immigration, because that was a big issue. That was where everything was very divisive at the State of the Union speech. And he said his article is to look at the truth of why the president might be against immigration, at least the way immigration has been done. He's not against immigration, he's against the way immigration has been done. Just bringing in people willy-nilly in chain migration and all this other stuff. So Daniel goes through some of the statistics. In federal kidnapping cases, 44% of the charges and cases are against immigrants. Process that. They constitute about 8% of the population. 44%. I think, well, I'd have to look up the exact article. I think at 30% sex crimes. And so he talks about what's behind the kidnapping exceptionalism among immigrants. Federal kidnapping charges often involve human trafficking, and human trafficking is one of those jobs that Americans aren't doing. Federal kidnapping charges also have been leveled at members of the violent MS-13 gang, whose cause has now become popular on the open borders left. In one MS-13 murder in a Washington, D.C. bedroom community, the suspects were hit with kidnapping charges that were easier to prove. MS-13's habit of abducting and murdering its victims helps raise kidnapping rates. They kidnap, they extort, they rape, and they rob, President Trump declared, and they certainly kidnap. And you saw when he brought up, he had the couple families from Long Island whose 16-year-old daughters, I believe it was, had been murdered by MS-13. And then I saw Democrats running around saying, oh, there's not really that a problem with MS-13. I mean, you talk about living in a post-truth society. I only bring this up is because, folks, from here on, it does not get better. It does not get better as I understand the way things are unfolding. And it's going to unfold in the broader culture, in government, in institutions, and the church. And so when you see that one guy from, I think he was from Stanford in that post-truth video clip, he said, oh, you know, there were other parts of it where he said, you know, it's going to get better because things are being exposed more. But as things are exposed more, we don't like what we see. He was right on that point. And it's very difficult. So, did you see the memo? The president released the memo of the House Intelligence Committee. It was unclassified. It has resulted in just an incredible amount of back and forth, charges, counter charges, fake news, real news, truth, conspiracy, anything that you want you can find about this particular memo. This is the front page of the Wall Street Journal at the top. GOP memo release fuels rancor. In the Washington Post this morning, Party of Law and Order picks defiance. At FBI, fears of lasting damage. So what they say is that, it's the Washington Post notes that this is a reversal. Now the left is all supportive of the FBI. And that ought to tell you something right there. That ought to be huge red flag warning that if the left is supporting it, then because they're usually wrong. That's the point. So this, I don't even remember where I got this, the good breakdown of all the different people involved. Daniel Greenfield has a good article on it. Here's another article that appeared. Outcry over the Nunes memo is damning for Democrats and the FBI and the way this was constructed. The author of this article, Jonathan Turley, a law professor, said this: "My greatest concern is not what is what is not in the dossier. Classified information jeopardizing national security. Leaders like Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi declared that the committee had moved beyond dangerous irresponsibility and disregard for our national security and disregarded the warnings of the Justice Department and the FBI. Now we can read the memo. There is a sharp and alarming disconnect between the descriptions of Pelosi and the House Intelligence Committee's ranking minority member Adam Schiff and the actual document. It clearly does not contain information that would reveal sources or methods." Well, it does contain information that would reveal sources or methods, and some of those relate back to who all was involved in this. And what you get, and Daniel Greenfield has a really great article on it, titled, I didn't put it in, 5 things you should learn from this. And another article, he talked about the things that you should learn from the disclosure of this memo. And Daniel does a great job of taking it back to its ultimate source, and that is Bill and Hillary Clinton. This is no different. The smears that resulted from this memo is no different than what the Clinton campaign through their operatives did to Dan Quayle back in 1991 during the campaign. If you remember, it came out that Dan Quayle and I went to the same law school. He graduated 5 or 6 years a few years before I got there. But so I was in Indiana at the time. So Dan Quayle was a senator, and everybody, a congressman, then a senator, and so a lot about the Quayles. And everybody was, what came out was there was a guy in prison who said he had sold marijuana to Dan Quayle when he was in law school. Now, what was the source of that information? And then the information came out, they're keeping this guy in solitary confinement so nobody can talk to him. The guy's name was Brent Kimberlin. Brent Kimberlin was known in Indianapolis, and we lived in the Speedway area at the time as the Speedway bomber. Bombs were going off and maiming people. They were losing limbs, and those were tied to Brent Kimberlin. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison, which means he might be getting out in 10 years. He was a con man. He was an evil con man. But that was the source. Then there was that from a Clinton operative came that Quayle had purchased cocaine when he was in the Senate. It was all fake. It was all untrue. And then it got leaked to the press. Well, the same pattern showed itself here, is that they got this dossier made up about Trump with information from Russia that he had met with prostitutes in Russia, in Moscow, and that sort of thing. And it came from somebody who was funded by the Clinton campaign. And then this lady down here, Linda Orr, she worked for Fusion GPS that did this. And this is the basis that they went to the Federal Intelligence Surveillance Court, the FISC, and got a surveillance order on people involved with the Trump campaign. And it's sort of like, if that hadn't taken place, a lot of this stuff we wouldn't be fighting over this Mueller investigation right now. And it may taint some of the prosecutions or guilty pleas that have taken place thus far. And so the question is, was the FBI negligent or were they intentionally doing this? Well, listen, the center pivot point is there in the middle of that picture. And there's a good interview with Frank Gaffney, and I can't remember his name, from Friday's Secure Freedom radio show. You should go listen to it. He's a former FBI guy. He works with Judicial Watch. Very intelligent guy, talking about this is what we've seen over time is the way the Clintons work. And he talked about the emails that they finally got out of the State Department, and he says if anybody else other than Hillary Clinton and Huma Abedin had treated classified information in this manner, and I had a national security clearance, top secret clearance, you did, Frank, and if any of us had done any of this, we would be in Leavenworth right now. So everybody is upset. Here's a little. This comes from this. I remember this guy named Evan McMullen, from Utah, who ran for president and everything. And he goes, well, he's out there. You can read his tweet. If the FISA applications failed to mention who funded Chris Steele's research, perhaps they should have. Regardless, it would have been careless of law enforcement to have excluded such alarming national security information from such a trusted source and ally of the United States. That's a slam at, we got the information from Russia. And he was very anti-Trump, continues to be. I'm going to play a clip from someone talking about the deep state and what the deep state might do, and the admonition of the person who says, if you don't want people to believe in a deep state and what the deep state might do to take down Trump, then don't talk like there is a deep state. Listen to what this guy says. This is on CNN.
Which the president's talking about basically corruption at the FBI today, but we oppose the leadership. The workforce is going to look at this and say, this is an attack on our ability to conduct an investigation with integrity. There's hundreds of agents and analysts working on this investigation. It's not just Christopher Wray, the FBI director. So the FBI people, I'm going to tell you, are ticked. And they're going to be saying, I guarantee it, you think you can push us off this because you can try to intimidate the director? You better think again, Mr. President. You've been around for 13 months. We've been around since 1908. I know how this game is going to be played. We're going to win.
Yeah, the FBI has been around since 1908. So we're going to take you down, Trump, if you oppose us. That's what he says. And people say, well, there's no deep state. There's nobody. Well, then the guys who are doing this, and I forget who this guy is. He's a former government official, might even have been in the FBI. But then don't talk like there is a deep state, that you're going to take Trump down. It's stunning to me. I've never seen everything so divided. It's troubling. Okay, let's look at the Middle East, where it's easy to figure out what's going on over there, right? So this came from the Institute for the Study of War. Warning update: pro-Assad coalition sets to escalate in southern Syria. And so what you see here is this area in southern Syria. Hang on here a second. That didn't show up better, does it? The green one? My wife was telling me I need to change the color on my laser pointer. I'm going to go back to red. So, southern Syria. Now, just a little bit of history lesson. In 2011, in March of 2011, a number of us were in Israel. We were staying right here at the southern end of the Sea of Galilee, here on the left. About 30 miles away in Dara, they had riots. Those riots eventually spread throughout the country, and now we have a country we call Syria, but really isn't Syria anymore. It's sort of a divided country. And in the southern part of Syria, there are a number of different parties that are in control. This color area here, that's pretty much under the control of Al-Qaeda. This gray area here, this is Israel right here. This is the Golan Heights right here. Many of you have been up in this area. Here's Quneitra. There's an overlook here. Damascus is from here to the outskirts of Damascus. That distance is about 25 miles. Majul Shams is up in here. Mount Hermon is up in this area. Caesarea Philippi, Tel Dan over to this direction. So just to give you some geography. This area is still controlled by ISIS. This is a current map as of a couple weeks ago. And so the statement was that the pro-Assad forces, which are sort of in the purple area, want to increase their presence. They want to take that area back. And so that this is a warning update. And here's what it says here. The collapse of the ceasefire, this is from understandingwar.org, the Institute for the Study of War. The collapse of the ceasefire in southern Syria would apply significant pressure on the U.S. as well as its allies in Jordan and Israel. The de-escalation zone has failed to constrain both Iran and al-Qaeda despite an overall decrease in violence in southern Syria. The resumption of hostilities would nonetheless generate new military and humanitarian crises along the Golan Heights and the Syrian-Jordanian border. The violence would also present an opportunity, if not counteracted, for further consolidation by Iran and al-Qaeda in southern Syria. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu likely discussed these challenges in talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow on January 29th. The U.S. must not be taken by surprise by the collapse of its flawed truce, but rather set conditions to minimize further risks to our interests and allies in southern Syria. Now, it sounds like we got a problem, there could be war. There was a Russian fighter jet that was shot down, pilot killed, up in the northern part of Syria yesterday. The report said this week, this is on the front page of this morning's New York Times, either today or yesterday. Egypt and Israel secretly allied in Sinai battle. And that, so for many years, and you remember this is a picture of the crash of the Russian jetliner that was shot down in the Sinai about 3 years ago, 2015. And since that time, Israel and Egypt have been working very closely together to get things to fight ISIS and other extremist groups in that area, which is kind of an interesting scenario because Israel is sort of allied with Egypt, sort of allied with Saudi Arabia. How far that will be able to go is difficult. At the UN, about a week ago Thursday or Friday, there was a meeting of the Security Council where they had a 3-hour meeting on peace in the Middle East. And here is the Palestinian representative that I'm going to play for you, Danny Danon, a longer clip of some information that he has about what's going on in that area of the northern border of Israel. First, the Palestinian guy.
We have consistently demonstrated our good faith and our commitment to peace. This has been done despite the enormous sacrifice we have been asked to make in the context of the historic compromise devised by the international community in the form of the two-state solution on the 1967 lines. We accepted this compromise 30 years ago in 1988 and have adhered to it ever since throughout every phase of the peace process from Oslo forward. Recent developments, to the contrary, must not dissuade us from moving forward on this basis, but rather must strengthen our resolve. We reiterate here.
Well, when he starts off saying that they've been committed to the peace process, it's just talk about living in a post-truth world. So Danny Danon, the ambassador of the U.S. To the UN, ambassador of Israel to the UN, gave this information. I have a slide. Hang on a second here. I'm going to have to exit out here. Well, so I'll do this. Sorry about that. Excuse me for the delay here. I don't know what happened here. Well, I know what happened. I didn't do what I was supposed to do. That's pretty obvious. But he actually reveals classified information in his talk here, and so I think it's important to listen to some of this of what he says. Now, most of this is going to relate to the northern border of Israel.
I speak to you today because of the dangerous activities of the Iranian regime. Dangerous activities that only grow stronger, only grow more deadly with every passing day. We have cautioned you about Iranian extremism time and again. We have warned of Iranian tentacles of terror spreading far and wide. We have repeatedly shown clear evidence of Iran's buildup in Lebanon through its proxy, Hezbollah. And we have watched too many countries sit silently while Iran sneaks into Israel's backyard. Iran has invested up to $35 billion in Syria. $35 billion. Mr. President, we have spoken about the terror Iran spreads throughout the world. We have warned about Iran's military advancement in our region, but words are not enough. I will now share with you classified information that clearly shows the extent of Iran's military buildup in Syria. We are releasing this information so that the world understands the growing Iranian threat. Today, there are 82,000 fighters directly under Iranian authority in Syria. This includes 3,000 members of Iran's infamous Revolutionary Guard, 9,000 fighters from Iran's proxy, Hezbollah, and 10,000 members of violent Shia militias recruited from across the Middle East, including Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. In addition, Iran directly commands 60,000 local Syrian fighters. One thing is clear. The Shiite crescent has reached our doorstep. Iran is ready to strike at a moment's notice. General Muhammad Ali Falaki of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard confirmed this alarming fact. He described the Guard's forces throughout the Middle East as one unified army, created to protect Shiite power, defend the supreme leader, and attack Israel from the north. Not from a string of Iranian terror cells, but from a full-blown Iranian military frontier. From Israel's perspective, our northern border is one northern front. We have Iran's proxy Hezbollah on one hand and Iran in Syria on the other. We can no longer distinguish between Lebanon and Syria. Let me be clear. Israel takes no sides in the Syrian civil war. We support the 1974 agreement on disengagement, but we will always defend ourselves. We will always take any necessary actions to secure our borders and protect our citizens. An Iranian presence in Syria will work just like ISIS. It will quickly spill into Europe and then across the globe. The Shiite crescent is alive and well. Do not let Iran turn it into a Shiite horizon. Iran has a simple but criminal plan. First, destroy Israel. Second, destabilize and terrorize the region. And third, threaten the entire world.
And so, this is an article from the Jerusalem Post about a week ago where he talked about this. 82,000 fighters in Syria that they control. This is a poll that was in the Jerusalem Post. Most Iranians are critical of the nuke deal, but support Hezbollah. So we talk about this potential revolution in the area, and the fact of the matter is that it's
one thing is clear.
It's not. There's my. I guess I did put them in. So we talked about the Shia Crescent, which goes from Yemen, and the dark green areas are Shia areas. The lighter green areas are Sunni areas. So you can see that but the divide in population is about 85%, 80% Sunni to 15% or so Shia. There's also an Alawite sect, which is where the Assad family comes from, that's sort of related to Shia Islam. But you can see that one of the goals is this Iranian influence from Yemen all the way to Syria, and then to create this land bridge all the way across Syria and northern Iraq to the Mediterranean. It's gone through different reiterations over the years. Of course, now Crown Prince bin Salman is heading up the Iranian or the Saudi contingency, and of course Rouhani and Khamenei are still involved here. Defense Minister Lieberman said that if there is a war up there, we're going to have to go deep into Lebanon to take care of everything. And I played you clips of people from the Israeli Air Force and Defense Force about that they're not, if they do go this time, they're not holding back. In the Debka file, it was reported that Khamenei's number 2, the guy behind Rouhani, was in Lebanon speaking to Hezbollah, and he said this: it was Hezbollah's fighting capacity alone that generated resistance in the Islamic countries. Allah willing, we shall soon witness the liberation of Jerusalem. And then I mentioned this earlier, the Russian jet that was shot down. Prime Minister Netanyahu went to Russia. He met with Putin to discuss the fact that we're going to defend ourselves. We're going to take whatever action we find necessary. At the same time that this is going on, President Trump, through Jared Kushner, is pushing some kind of get a peace plan in agreement, get some kind of agreement between the Palestinians and Israel, and get peace. And you don't read much about it. Apparently, the team is about 5 people: Jason Greenblatt, Jason Kushner, and a few others. They get information from the State Department, but they don't really talk to the State Department. In the national interest, this article, it's kind of an interesting article, says that Kushner's kind of the post-millennial guy that relates to the large contingent of post-millennial Arabs. They don't really remember the 67 war, the 73 war, and they wonder why there can't be peace, because they see Israel living in relative prosperity and they want to share that. So Kushner is supposedly trying to work with this. This article says this: behind the scenes, he is making surprising progress towards that. The Palestinian response to a lot of this, with Trump's announcement about Jerusalem being Israel's capital, eradicate has been pretty brutal in his criticism of Nikki Haley, telling her to shut up. Eradicate said that Haley's impudence has gone as far as calling for removing Abbas from power. Now, this is a post-truth statement. She called for overthrowing, Eradicate said, the democratically elected Palestinian president. He was elected to a 4-year term in 2003. And so he's now in the 13th or 14th year of a 4-year term. So I don't understand why everybody can said this. Now, there's all this push now that there's going to be Trump's just going to go ahead and reveal his peace plan. These are just a series of articles that came out over the last few days that he's just going to move forward, and he's telling the Palestinians it's time to either, take it or leave it. They say, while the details of Trump's peace plan have yet to be released, the plan reportedly differs radically from those offered by his predecessors. According to reports regarding the plan, the Palestinian Authority would be offered non-contiguous parts of Judea and Samaria with limited sovereignty and without eastern Jerusalem as its capital city. Jewish towns in Judea and Samaria, for the most part, would be allowed to remain in place. In addition, no Palestinian Arabs would be granted a right of return to Israel. The Jordanian king came out, said that, well, the Palestinians are entitled to a capital in East Jerusalem. Now, I want you to put in context what I think about what Abdullah said, and he said this at Davos, and I want to relate to you the thing that I had showed you previously. I mentioned this a few weeks ago about Gibeah. Here is the Temple Mount. This is the old city of Jerusalem right here, down in the sort of bottom center. If you go north on the main road out of Jerusalem, Highway 60, there is a little place, a hill called Gibeah. This is what it looks like from the top of Gibeah. It's one of the most prominent high places in the entire city of Jerusalem. And what you learn when you study history is this is the tribal area of King Saul, the tribe of Benjamin. He was from the tribe of Benjamin. And this was their sort of main city or town back in the days of Saul. He was, of course, the first king of Israel. On top of that building, or top of that, the prior picture was taken from the top of this building here. And what is this building? This building is the palace that was being built by King Hussein of Jordan, the father of King Abdullah, when the 67 war broke out. Well, what happened in the 67 war was Israel took that area and the building stopped. And so 50 years later, this building sits there unfinished. Now, I say that to point out, to put into context Abdullah's lies that the Palestinians should have a capital in East Jerusalem, because he's not a Palestinian. His father wasn't a Palestinian, but his father was building a palace in Jerusalem. And he was building it in a place to make a point. Your first king was here, I'm building on his site. That's what they were trying to make the point. So you need to listen to everything that Abdullah says through that lens. I'm going to play a couple clips of him from Davos. He was interviewed at Davos, and Fareed Zachariah asked him some questions about the peace process.
Jerusalem is such an emotional subject for everybody. And I think we have to look to the future of what we want for Jerusalem. Is Jerusalem a city that ends up dividing us, which I think would be catastrophic for mankind? Or is it a city of hope that brings us together? It is eternal to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And if you remember His Holiness Pope Francis's message in Christmas, hoping that Jerusalem will be dealt with as part of a negotiated settlement, that the status quo is represented. So it's as important to Muslims as it is to Christians. And all the Christian church leaders in Jerusalem have asked Jordan to plea on their behalf to the United Nations and international community. So this is not just a one-off for Jews and Muslims. This is a city that could either create tremendous problems for us in the future, or it is an umbrella that gives us hope on how we propel. And I've said this before, strategic is a Greek word. You won't find it in the Hebrew or Arabic dictionary. And I think that's one of the problems that we're facing. So these decisions are made. What are we thinking of Jerusalem looking like down the road? And it could be a tremendous city that brings us together, or it could create aggression and violence that we've never seen before.
Now, do you understand sort of the prophetic import of what he just said? Zachariah said that Jerusalem would be what? A burdensome stone for all peoples of the world. All peoples would be gathered against it. Now, I don't know if he knows that, passage, and you know, when Bible prophecy teachers such as myself and others bring up this passage in Zachariah, they're like, you know, it's not going to happen. It's already been fulfilled, or it's just sort of metaphorical. But now you have one of the leaders of that region, King Abdullah. His family used to control the holy sites of Islam until the House of Saud took him over back in the 30s from his family, and they were given this kingdom in Jordan. And he says Jerusalem will either unite mankind or it will cause a catastrophe unlike anything we've ever seen. Now that sounds very much like what Zachariah said. And that the ability of Jerusalem to unite all mankind implies that if we just get the right leader in Jerusalem, we can do that. And I think these things kind of fly by and we don't sit and look. And I was going to play this last week, but I wanted to reflect on it a little bit. Like, did I really hear what I just heard? And he says this at Davos about Jerusalem, and did you hear a ripple in the crowd about, oh, no, that's not true. What are you saying? They didn't say anything. He went on to talk a little bit more. Here's some more.
During the campaign for the presidency, Donald Trump said something on CNN, actually. He said, I think Islam hates us. By us, I think he meant America. In your conversations with President Trump, have you tried to persuade him that that was not the case?
Absolutely, to all Americans, and whether I'm in Washington in the Congress or with the administration, I think maybe there's a lack of understanding of Islam. Islam is built on moral virtues that you see in Christianity and Judaism and other religions. It is not a religion of hate. We, as Muslims, believe in Jesus Christ as the Messiah. We believe in the Holy Virgin Mother. We believe in the Bible and the Torah. And I think this is the way that all of us were brought up. And I've said it before, when we all greet each other as Arabs and Muslims, we say, Assalamu alaikum, peace be unto you. That is probably the most said sentence that anybody says from the minute he gets up in the morning to goes to sleep at night. And I think that is the basis of Islam. We have challenges because there are fringe groups that have created problem. As I've said before, we have a fight inside of Islam. This is a civil war between all of us and those that not only consider us heretics, but consider Christians, Jews, and other religions all heretics and should be put to the sword. The problem that we have now, and maybe the lack of understanding, is that it's us Muslims working side by side with Christians, Jews, and other religions to fight this scourge, which is still going to be a long-term problem. This is not going to be something to be resolved. In other words, as I've said, Third World War by other means. So in the United States, the challenge has to be, I'm not so worried about the United States being affected by terrorists getting in. The secure program on protecting the United States is quite robust. What you don't want, and not just in the United States, in my country or in Europe, is to have the Muslim population feeling victimized and isolated, and that creates a breeding ground of contempt because everybody hates us. And I'm more worried that the narrative creates more internal challenges of security if Muslims that, at the end of the day, we all want a better life. We want a better future for our children and their children.
Well, you get the point where he's coming from. This came out this week, a report from the Council of Europe's Committee on, I think, Intolerance, Commission Against Racism and Intolerance. And they issued a report, and they have a bunch of reports on their website about this country and that country. And the report on the UK, the United Kingdom, was that, hey, the press needs to stop saying that these terrorists are Muslim. And there's similar things afoot in Australia and other places to shut down the truth. The 83-page report states, ECRI, European Commission on Racism and Intolerance, considers that in the light of the fact that Muslims are increasingly under the spotlight as a result of recent ISIS-related terrorist acts around the world, Fueling prejudice against Muslims shows a reckless disregard not only for the dignity of the great majority of Muslims in the UK, but also for their safety. In this context, to a recent study by Teesside University, suggesting that where the media stress the Muslim background of perpetrators of terrorist acts and devotes significant coverage to it, the violent backlash against Muslims is likely to be greater than in cases where the perpetrator's motivation is downplayed or rejected in favor of alternative explanations. Boy, talk about a post-truth society. So here's a memo. You need to, there are a lot of memos this week. Here's another memo that came out. And here's what, in an audacious move, the report recommends the British media be barred from reporting the Muslim background of terrorists. And so things that happen like this, where you go to a mosque and they're shouting, "Death to Israel, curse upon the Jews, death to America, death to Israel, curse upon the Jews, victory to Islam," should be ignored. It's just absolutely insane. Don't really have time to talk much about Turkey. This is Putin's or Prime Minister Netanyahu's meeting with Israel. This was kind of an interesting editorial in the New York Times, talking about autocrats steamroll. I know this is the front page of the New York Times. Autocrats steamroll opponents with no objections from the U.S. So what are they saying? Well, al-Sisi in Egypt is a tyrant. He's a despot. He's an autocrat. And he's moving on his people and shutting down democracy and that type of thing. And Trump's letting it happen. It's all Trump's fault. Yet Obama went to Egypt and sort of lit the match that turned into the Arab Spring. And this is why people don't trust these people anymore. Because they lie, they make it up. And they talk about other things. Okay, I'll finish with this. I'll actually get out a little bit sooner this week. Dr. Martin Sherman is the head of the IIIS, International Institute for Safety and Strategy and Security. IISS, I think is what it's called. A very intelligent man. And he has this great article that he wrote in Ars Shiva this week. And he talks about, it was about a week ago, I guess, talks about the entire issue of Palestinian national identity as a giant hoax, intended to be no more than a temporary ruse until the Jewish hold on sovereignty in the Holy Land, any part of the Holy Land, is pried loose. And he goes on, he talks about, we don't even really talk the truth about the enemy that we face in the Palestinian Authority, or the PLO, or Hamas, or the Palestinian Authority, or whatever. And this is something that has been true since the beginning. And he says this, D-Day is approaching. The Arabs have waited 19 years for this and will not flinch from the war of liberation. This is what Yasser Arafat's predecessor said back in early 1960, June of 67, just before the Six-Day War. There's a fight for the homeland. It is either us or the Israelis. There is no middle road. The Jews of Palestine will have to leave. We will facilitate their departure to their former homes. Any of the old Palestinian Jewish population who survived may stay, but it is my impression that none of them will survive. We shall destroy Israel and its inhabitants for the survivors. If there are any, the boats are ready to deport them. And so what Sherman says, Dr. Sherman says in his article is, listen, the ocean is the ocean, and the Palestinians, the Palestinians. I really don't expect either to change much in my lifetime. The war between Arab and Jew for control of the Holy Land has dragged on for well over 100 years. For the last 7 decades, the Arab effort has focused on an attempt to first thwart the establishment of a sovereign Jewish state, and then, when that failed, to destroy it. And he goes on to talk about the fact that in their charter and their founding documents, they put in things about Palestinian identity. And you saw King Abdullah talk about it like it really exists. This quote in the article: "The creation of a Palestinian state is only a means for continuing our struggle against the state of Israel. It is only for political and tactical reasons that we speak today about the existence of a Palestinian people, since Arab national interests demand that we posit the existence of a distinct Palestinian people to oppose Zionism." Sherman says, "It is thus clear that as a collective, the Palestinian Arabs comprise the spearhead in the Arab struggle against Jewish sovereignty. It would be a grave error to dismiss this as merely the opinion of a single long-forgotten Palestinian leader. Indeed, it is a view that over the years has been expressed by many Arabs, Palestinian or otherwise, from Aruk Kadumi to King Hussein, the father of King Abdullah. More recently, it was boldly and brazenly articulated by Mahmoud Abbas himself in his January 14th tirade before the PLO's Central Council, where he spewed, 'Israel is a colonial project that has nothing to do with Jews.'" And he goes on to show about the creation of these Arab councils. And this is Article 22 of the Charter of the Palestinian. "Zionism is a political movement organically associated with international imperialism and antagonistic to all action for liberation and to progressive movements in the world. It is racist and fanatic in its nature, aggressive, expansionist, and colonial in its aims, and fascist in its methods. Israel is the instrument of the Zionist movement and geographical base for world imperialism placed strategically in the midst of the Arab homeland to combat the hopes of the Arab nation for liberation, unity, and progress." Article 12 of that same charter says this: "The Palestinian people believe in Arab unity. In order to contribute their share toward the attainment of that objective, however, they must, at the present stage of their struggle, safeguard their Palestinian identity and develop their consciousness of that identity and oppose any plan that may dissolve or impair it." Sherman goes on, "Accordingly, to devise effective policy to contend with abiding Arab enmity, Israel must correctly conceptualize the conflict over the issue Jewish sovereignty in the Holy Land. In this regard, it should be painfully clear that the conflict is one between two irreconcilable collectives, a Jewish collective and an Arab collective, for which today the Palestinian Arab collective is its operational spearhead." At the bottom, last paragraph, "is a clash of collectives whose outcome will be determined by collective victory or defeat. It cannot be personalized. The fate of individual members of one collective cannot be a deciding determinant of the policy of the rival collective, and certainly not a consideration that impacts the probability of collective defeat or victory." And he makes a couple points. And there is an implacable enemy, not a prospective peace partner, and recognizing enmity as realism, not racism. So he concludes that this is a fool's errand. And boy, you have to think it's true. So the question is, do we keep going or do we withdraw? Caroline Glick has a great article this week called "Time for Greenblatt to Walk Away." What's the pictures of? What's the video that's going on right now? This took place in Bethlehem. There were a group of U.S. businessmen that went down there to help Palestinians, Arabs, to create business opportunities, how to run their business in a better way. They were met, they had rocks, eggs, and things thrown at them. You saw them break the mirror. They were pounding on them, and then they went out to a street there in Bethlehem, and they hung President Trump and Vice President Pence in effigy, and they set them on fire. So Israel has a lot of enemies. That's prophetic. Kurdish pastor, this was on CBN News the other day, that Turkey is a bigger threat to Israel than Iran. We don't even have time to talk about that today because Turkey's making some moves down. Pray for Christians in the Middle East. I get reports. I can't talk about where. What I'm just telling you is that there is, by the grace of God, an effective Christian witness in the Middle East. And people are coming to know the Lord. And Christians are standing bold in the face of persecution and arrest, and even to the point of losing their lives. They are standing bold and faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ. That ought to encourage us in our lives here. Look, I mean, our culture's in a mess. Our country's in a mess. There's more conflict than I've ever seen. We're still relatively free. But there are people that want to change that. So stay faithful. Stay grounded in the Word, because the world is trying to deceive you more now than ever. So let's pray. Father, thank you so much for your Word. Thanks for letting us know what's going to happen, Lord. I just pray that you will give us, empower us with your Spirit so that we can stand faithful as a solid witness to the gospel in evil days. In Jesus' name, amen.